Why was everyone staring at her like she had spoken a foreign language? The diner was full, the usual clink of forks against plates, the murmurs of small-town chatter. And then, silence. Sarah Martinez hadn't planned the words. They just slipped out, steady but trembling, louder than she expected. "I'm joining the army." Her mother dropped a plate in the kitchen. Mr. choked on his coffee. Even Jake, the teenage regular who liked to puff his chest and talk tough about what he'd do to the terrorists, froze mid-sentence. Every head turned toward her as though the quiet girl from Texas had just announced she was leaving for the moon. Sarah's hands shook as she set the coffee pot back on the counter. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. Not yet. But something had been building inside her ever since that September morning when the towers fell. She had sat in front of the television with the rest of the country, tears streaming down her cheeks, unable to look away. And while others spoke of fear, of revenge, of confusion, Sarah felt something different. It was a pull, a whisper deep in her chest telling her she couldn't just watch. She had to do something. Her father didn't understand. "You've never even been in a fight, Sarah, not once in your life." His voice cracked with anger he couldn't hide. Her mother begged through tears, clutching her daughter's arm in the quiet of the kitchen. "Baby, you don't have to do this. Let other people go fight. You're safe here." And her younger brother had looked at her with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Sarah, you hate loud noises. You cover your ears during fireworks. How are you supposed to go to war?" But Sarah couldn't explain it in a way they would understand. She didn't feel brave. She didn't feel strong. She only knew she couldn't stand still. Something inside her was shifting, pushing her forward. The recruiting office smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. The man behind the desk, Sergeant Johnson, looked at her the way so many did, like she didn't belong there. But when he asked the question, "Why do you want to serve?" she surprised him with her answer. "I want to help people who can't help themselves." He studied her for a long moment. No fire in her voice, no thirst for revenge, just a quiet determination that didn't waver, even under his skeptical gaze. From that day, Sarah's life became a storm. Neighbors who used to smile at her shook their heads when she jogged past them in the mornings, breath ragged, pushing her body farther than she ever thought possible. She ran in the Texas heat, sweat stinging her eyes, each step a small rebellion against the life she used to know. At the gym, her hands blistered on the pull-up bar. Her arms trembled under the weight of push-ups. But she kept going. She had no map for what she was becoming, only a direction: forward. Basic training stripped her bare. Drill sergeants screamed until her ears rang. Her muscles tore and rebuilt themselves. Fellow recruits doubted her, whispered behind her back that she'd never make it. More than once, she found herself crying into her pillow at night, tempted to quit, to go back to the safety of the diner and her mother's cooking. But then she would remember the faces on the television, the desperate leap from fire and smoke, the helplessness of that morning in September. She would whisper to herself, "Not yet, not here." And she would wake up the next morning ready to try again. Day by day, something inside her hardened, not her kindness, not her quiet heart, but the belief that fear didn't have to be in control. She learned to stand, to speak louder, to stop apologizing for existing. The timid girl who once blushed when someone called her name began to move with quiet certainty. She discovered something unexpected, too. In the chaos of training drills, in the staged emergencies when others froze, Sarah became steady. Her hands stopped shaking when someone was bleeding out during exercises. Her breathing slowed when the pressure mounted. Instructors noticed. They pushed her harder, tested her with scenarios designed to break recruits. Yet Sarah found a strange calm when everything around her spun into panic. Medical training unlocked something she hadn't known was there. Holding pressure on a wound, threading a needle through torn flesh, improvising care with nothing but gauze and grit. This was where she came alive. She didn't just pass her courses. She excelled. When she stepped off the transport plane in Afghanistan, the reality of war hit her like the dry heat that clung to her lungs. Dust swirled around the base. Helicopters roared overhead. Soldiers moved with purpose, their eyes sharp, their weapons heavy. The girl from Texas who once waited tables was standing in the middle of a world where life and death decisions were made every minute. Her first weeks blurred together. Wounded men carried in on stretchers, screams echoing inside the medical tent, blood that no book could have prepared her for. She washed her hands until her skin cracked, but the images clung to her like shadows. At night, she lay awake, listening to the distant thump of mortars, wondering if she could survive another day of it. And yet, when chaos struck, Sarah became something else. The girl who jumped at fireworks back home no longer flinched when mortars landed nearby. When others ducked for cover, Sarah pressed harder on a wound. When helicopters crashed outside the perimeter, she was the first running toward the smoke. Her calm spread like fire breaks through panic. Soldiers started seeking her out, not because she was the best, not because she was the fastest, but because when Sarah was there, fear loosened its grip. They started calling her Steady Hands. But Sarah didn't feel steady. Inside, she wrestled with doubt every night. She thought about her mother crying back in Texas, about disbelief, about whether she truly belonged among warriors. And yet morning came, and she found herself walking back into the tent, pulling on gloves, telling the next terrified soldier, "You're going to be okay." She believed it, even when she didn't believe in herself. What Sarah didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the day would come when she would have to choose between obedience and compassion, when bullets would carve through the night, and she would have to run into the fire while others stayed behind. The girl who once whispered apologies for taking up space was about to become the woman who changed the course of a mission no one thought possible. But for now, Sarah sat on the edge of her cot, listening to the helicopters thrum against the Afghan sky. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself the same promise she had since that Tuesday morning back home. "I won't stand still." Because sometimes courage isn't loud. Sometimes it isn't obvious. Sometimes it's just the decision to take one more step forward, even when everything in you wants to turn back. And that's where her story truly began, quietly, with trembling hands in a world on fire. Why was she the only one at the table not leaning forward? Maps and satellite images covered the briefing room. The men around her, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Special Operations soldiers, studied every detail with practiced eyes. They looked carved from stone. Silent, focused, intimidating. And in the middle of them sat Sarah Martinez, the quiet medic from Texas who still sometimes doubted she belonged here. Her pulse pounded as Captain Mitchell, the SEAL team leader, described the mission. His voice was firm, clipped, every syllable a reminder of the stakes. The target, a remote Afghan village tucked in the mountains, where intelligence suggested a high-value terrorist leader was hiding. The complication, the same village was home to women and children who had nothing to do with the fight. "We go in precise, surgical, capture not kill. No civilian casualties," Mitchell said. His eyes flicked across the room, pausing briefly on Sarah. It wasn't just orders, it was a warning. She kept her face still, but her stomach tightened. They needed a medic, not just for their own wounded, but for civilians who might be caught in crossfire. And of all the medics on base, they had requested her. Sarah Martinez, the girl who used to pour coffee in a Texas diner. The room buzzed with unspoken questions. Some of the men glanced at her with approval, nodding slightly as if to say she had earned her place. Others looked doubtful, their silence heavy. Could she keep up? Could she carry her weight? Could she handle the brutality of what they all knew was coming? When Captain Mitchell looked directly at her, his words cut through the air. "You understand what you're volunteering for. This isn't the medical tent. This is the field. Limited supplies, enemy fire, no backup. If things go wrong, we may not get out." Sarah's mouth was dry, but her voice came steady. "I understand." Inside, her heart hammered, but she had learned long ago not to let fear show. That night, as she packed her medical gear, she thought of her mother's voice, "Baby, you don't have to do this," and her brother's disbelief. She tightened the straps on her pack anyway. The choice had been made long before the briefing. The helicopter ride was her first night mission. The blackness outside was total, broken only by the ghostly green glow of night vision. The aircraft rattled as it skimmed low through mountain valleys. Sarah sat between two broad-shouldered operators, her pack heavy against her back, her hands clenched to keep them from shaking. No one spoke. The only sounds were the thrum of the rotor and the distant bark of radio chatter. She tried to steady her breathing, matching the rhythm of the men beside her, but she could feel their doubt pressing against her like a weight. She was smaller, quieter, less hardened, and yet she was here. When the helicopter settled into a clearing miles from the village, the team moved with silent precision, weapons raised, eyes scanning every shadow. Sarah followed, her boots crunching against the rocky terrain. Her pack dug into her shoulders, almost 60 pounds, but when one of the rangers offered to carry some of her gear, she shook her head. "I've got it." She wasn't going to be anyone's burden. The hike through the mountains felt endless. Thin air burned her lungs. Sweat trickled down her spine despite the night chill. But she kept up. Every step was proof, not to them but to herself, that she belonged on this mission. As the village came into view, Sarah adjusted her night vision goggles. A cluster of buildings, lamplight flickering in a few windows. It looked peaceful, ordinary, and yet intelligence said otherwise. The plan was clear. Surround the target building, move in fast, capture, no collateral damage. Sarah's role, stay back, then move forward once the area was secured to treat whoever needed her, soldier, civilian, or even enemy. But war rarely listens to plans. The first gunfire shattered the silence before they even reached the perimeter. It was as if the night itself exploded. Muzzle flashes burst from windows. Bullets cracked against walls. The village erupted into chaos. Sarah dove behind a low stone wall, her heart slamming against her ribs. Screams echoed from nearby houses, women, children layered against the roar of automatic fire. Mitchell barked orders, trying to keep his team coordinated, but the plan was already gone. The call came through the radio, sharp and urgent. A SEAL was down, exposed, bleeding heavily. Sarah's training surged to the surface. She grabbed her pack, ready to move, but Captain Mitchell's hand clamped down on her arm. "Too dangerous. Wait," he shouted over the gunfire. Her eyes met his. In that instant, everything stilled. She saw the calculation in his face, the cold logic of a soldier, but she also heard the weakening cries of the man bleeding out in the square. "He won't survive if we wait," she said. Her voice was steady, more steady than she felt. Mitchell hesitated, but Sarah didn't. She slung her rifle across her back, adjusted the straps of her pack, and broke into a run. The streets lit up with fire. Bullets ripped the air. She darted between buildings, heart pounding, lungs burning, every step a gamble. She could feel the enemy tracking her, chasing her shadow with their muzzles. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Petty Officer Davis lay sprawled behind an overturned cart, blood pooling beneath him. His voice had gone weak, his breath shallow. Sarah skidded to his side, dropped to her knees, and unzipped her pack with trembling hands that steadied the moment they touched gauze. The wound was worse than she imagined. His femur shattered, artery nicked. He had minutes, maybe less. She pressed hard on the wound, her gloves slick with blood, her mind narrowing into the calm tunnel she had discovered back in training. Her voice rose above the chaos, soft but firm. "Stay with me, Davis. You're not going home like this. You hear me?" But even as she fought for his life, a new dread pressed against her. The smoke from her improvised cover was thinning. The square was a kill zone. To drag him out now was suicide. She looked at the overturned cart, then at her supplies. If they couldn't move, they would make this their fortress. With a calm that seemed impossible, Sarah radioed Mitchell. "I'm staying with him until we can move. Don't waste your men trying to drag us out." Static crackled back, followed by Mitchell's furious voice. "That's an order, Martinez. Fall back." Her reply was sharper than she had ever spoken in her life. "No, sir. My duty is here." She set to work, turning bandages into camouflage, bottles into distractions, trauma shears into makeshift tools. Every scrap became part of her defense. The quiet girl from Texas, once too timid to raise her voice, was holding a position in the heart of enemy fire. And the men watching from cover, men who had doubted her, saw something they would never forget. How long could she hold this ground? 20 minutes had already passed. 20 minutes of enemy rounds snapping overhead, splintering wood, tearing into walls around her. 20 minutes of blood seeping through gauze as she fought to keep Petty Officer Davis alive behind the overturned cart. Her gloves were stained dark. Her knees ached from the stone ground. Her back screamed from the crouch she refused to abandon. And yet, her hands never faltered. "Stay awake," she whispered, her voice close to his ear. "Think of home, think of your wife. You're not leaving me here, you understand." Davis groaned, his words barely audible. "She makes the best peach pie," his voice cracked into silence. Sarah worked faster, IV line steady, pressure on the artery, fluids trickling into his veins as his skin paled. She talked to him constantly, not only to keep him awake, but because her own fear needed the rhythm of her voice to stay contained. The radio crackled again. Mitchell's voice was harsh, commanding. "Martinez, fall back. That's an order. We'll cover you." Her jaw tightened. She pressed her shoulder against the cart for cover, blood streaking her forearm as she reached for her radio. "Sir, if I move him, he dies. I'm staying." Silence, a silence louder than gunfire. Then a low growl of frustration before Mitchell cut the channel. Around her, the firefight raged. Every burst of automatic fire sent dust into her eyes. Every scream from a window reminded her that civilians were trapped in this village too, terrified, caught in between. Sarah's mind wrestled with a cruel truth. War never asked who was guilty and who was innocent. It swallowed everyone in reach. Then a voice broke through the chaos. "Medic!" Not over the radio, not in English. From the shadows of a doorway across the square, an elderly man stepped forward. His voice was accented but clear. His hands were raised, and in those hands a white cloth fluttered. Sarah froze, so did Davis. Mitchell's voice cut sharp into her earpiece. "Do not engage," could be a trap. But Sarah's eyes stayed locked on the man. Something in his face, lined, weathered, weary, pulled her memory back to the base, to the grandfathers who had carried their sick to her for help, to the villagers who trusted her steady hands even when they feared her uniform. Her instincts whispered, this was not a trap. This was someone who still believed in something human. Ignoring Mitchell's warning, she shouted back in broken Pashto the phrases she had practiced with locals. "I am medic. American. He is hurt. Do you have help?" The man nodded. His reply tumbled quickly, too fast for her to catch, but one word landed: doctor. "A doctor." Before anyone could stop him, the old man stepped into the open square. Enemy fire stuttered, then slowed. Confusion rippled through the fighters watching. Who would dare walk out during a battle? Sarah's heart pounded as he approached, each step surreal. The gunfire dwindled, uneasy. He reached her position, dropped to his knees without fear, and touched Davis's leg with practiced hands. His Pashto spilled fast, but his gestures were universal. Tourniquet here, fluids higher, pressure lower. Sarah's eyes widened. He wasn't just a villager, he was trained. "Name?" she asked, her voice trembling. He said, his English broken but enough. "Doctor, 30 years." In seconds, Sarah and Doctor fell into rhythm, hands moving, supplies passing between them, no need for full sentences. They worked as though they had always been a team. But then came the greater miracle. Doctor stood and shouted into the surrounding buildings. His voice rolled deep, carrying authority. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, his tone was unmistakable. Command, scolding, moral weight. The gunfire faltered, stopped. Sarah's breath caught. The silence was unnatural. "What the hell is going on?" Mitchell demanded over the radio. Doctor turned back to her, eyes sharp. "I tell them Islam. Wounded must be protected. Medic must be safe. This is law, God's law." Sarah's throat tightened. She looked at Davis, still alive barely because of this doctor's courage, and at the fighters who, for reasons beyond tactics, had lowered their rifles. The war had paused, not for strategy, not for power, but because an old man reminded everyone of something greater than bullets. Mitchell's voice, strained and disbelieving. "You're telling me we've got a ceasefire?" Doctor nodded firmly. "For him," he said, pointing at Davis. "You take him, then leave, no more shooting." It wasn't a victory, it wasn't clean, but it was life. Sarah looked across the square at Mitchell's position. She could see his silhouette, weapon-ready, head shaking in disbelief. Yet even he didn't order her to break it. Not this time. She and Doctor lifted Davis onto a wooden door ripped from its hinges, turning it into a stretcher. Sarah whispered encouragement the whole way as they carried him toward the extraction zone. Around them, the village watched. Fighters in doorways, rifles lowered. Civilians peeking from windows, all of them witnessing something that didn't fit into any war manual. The evacuation helicopter thumped in the distance, growing louder. Sarah's arms trembled as she held the stretcher, but she didn't let go. When the bird touched down, Davis squeezed her hand weakly, his voice hoarse and thin. "You didn't leave me." She swallowed hard. "Never." Captain Mitchell approached, face unreadable. Sarah braced herself for the reprimand, the fury she knew was coming. She had him, risked everything. But instead, Mitchell reached up, unpinned the trident from his chest, the symbol of his SEAL brotherhood, and pressed it into her palm. His voice was low, almost reverent. "What you did took more courage than I've seen in 15 years of war. You've earned this." The helicopter lifted, blades whipping dust around them. Sarah sat back, exhausted, watching the village shrink beneath them, a place where, for one impossible night, war had bent to mercy. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt broken, drained, raw. But inside, beneath the exhaustion, one truth burned steady. Sometimes courage isn't pulling the trigger. Sometimes it's standing your ground when the whole world screams at you to move. And sometimes, the bravest act in war is remembering you're still human. Why were they all looking at her differently this time? No suspicion, no doubt, just quiet expectation. The Marines who filled the briefing room weren't fresh recruits or green soldiers. They were reconnaissance operators, hardened, lean, carrying the kind of silence that only came from years of surviving in hostile places. Yet when Sarah entered the room, the conversations hushed. These men, who had once treated her as an outsider, now regarded her as if she were part of their corps. Her reputation had arrived before she did. They had heard about the Afghan village, about the square where she had refused to retreat, about the ceasefire negotiated in the middle of a firefight. The story had spread like wildfire through the special operations community. Some called it reckless, others called it a miracle, but no one that Sarah Martinez had done the unthinkable. Captain, the Marine team leader, gestured toward her. "This is the medic I told you about. She's not here to sit in the back. She's part of the plan." That sentence landed heavy. No one had ever said it like that before. On the table, maps of a Taliban stronghold spread out. Intelligence reports stacked thick beside them. Hostages, American contractors, were inside, injured, malnourished, time running out. "We're going in light and fast," explained. "Minimal support, no guarantee of quick, which means," he glanced at Sarah, "if they're still alive when we find them, you're the difference between life and death." Her chest tightened, but she nodded. She felt pressure before, but this was different. They weren't asking her to simply react when things went wrong. They were building the mission around the assumption that she could keep broken bodies alive in the worst conditions imaginable. For a moment her old self flickered inside, the quiet girl who once apologized for bumping shoulders in the diner, the one who hated loud noises and doubted her strength. That girl whispered, "Are you sure you belong here?" But then Sarah remembered the trident pin Mitchell had pressed into her palm. She remembered Davis's hand gripping hers, refusing to let go. And she answered the whisper with silence. She wasn't here to convince herself anymore. She was here to prove she could keep people breathing. The insertion was smooth. Night pressed against the mountains, the kind of blackness that swallowed shapes whole. Sarah moved with the team, her pack heavy but balanced, her steps quieter than she ever thought possible. She had learned how to walk like them, to carry herself in rhythm with the warfighters she once thought untouchable. They reached the compound with ghost-like silence. Through her goggles, Sarah watched as Marines melted into shadows, rifles raised, movements sharp and certain. She held her position, heart pounding, waiting for the breach. The explosion that cracked open the door was muffled, controlled. Shouts followed, muzzle flashes erupted, and then silence. "Clear," came the whisper. Sarah moved in. The room reeked of damp air and human suffering. 3 men sat slumped against the far wall, their wrists bound, their bodies frail. Their eyes, hollow, frightened, snapped open when they saw the Americans. "Martinez, they're yours," said. She dropped to her knees. The first hostage's skin was clammy, his pulse weak, dehydration obvious. The second's leg showed signs of infection, the swelling angry and red. The third, a gaunt man with bruises across his ribs, barely breathed. Her training took over. Gauze here, fluids there, antiseptic on one, stabilizing pressure on another. Her hands moved with speed, but her voice remained calm. "You're safe now. We've got you. Stay with me." The Marines provided cover, but they watched her, too. Not because they doubted, because they were in awe. She wasn't just patching wounds. She was running a triage center in the middle of a hostile compound, steady in ways most soldiers could only hope to be. 10 minutes stretched like hours. Sporadic gunfire popped outside. The building shook with distant explosions. But inside, Sarah's world narrowed to 3 lives in front of her. 3 men who had to make it home. The third hostage suddenly slumped, his chest stuttering. Sarah's heart lurched, cardiac arrest. "No," she whispered, fierce and determined. "Not now, not here." She launched into CPR, compression steady, breath harsh as she worked. Marines lifted the stretcher and moved toward extraction, and Sarah didn't stop. She kept pressing, rhythm unbroken, her body moving with theirs across rough terrain. It was a surreal sight, a small medic keeping a heartbeat alive while an elite recon team fought their way out around her. By the time they reached the helicopter, sweat streamed down her face, her arms screamed in pain, but the pulse flickered back. Faint, but there. She had dragged him back from the edge. As they loaded the hostages aboard, crouched beside her, his eyes, hard as stone, softened. "You don't just save lives, Martinez," he said. "You remind the rest of us why we fight at all." She wanted to answer, but exhaustion dragged her against the bulkhead of the aircraft. Her eyes closed for a moment, and all she could hear was the pounding of the rotor and the faint rhythm of the man's heartbeat under her hands. When the helicopter lifted into the night sky, Sarah realized something had shifted again. Not just her reputation, not just how others saw her, but how she saw herself. She wasn't the girl who had to prove she belonged anymore. She was the medic others trusted with their lives, the one they built missions around, the one who could hold the line between life and death when no one else could. And yet, as the wind whipped across her face, she knew the hardest test was still ahead. Something deeper, darker, more complex than anything she'd faced. Because saving the innocent was one thing, but soon she would be asked to save someone who was not innocent at all. And that would change everything. Why was she here, surrounded by generals and colonels whose names she had only ever seen in classified briefings? Sarah sat at the edge of the long table in Kabul, her uniform plain, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Around her, the room buzzed with the quiet authority of power, the kind of authority that didn't shout but whispered, and everyone listened. She should not have been here. She knew it. Yet all eyes turned to her as the senior officer spoke. The prisoner won't survive without immediate surgery, and without him we lose the intelligence he carries. Attacks are already in motion. Lives, American lives, depend on him staying alive. A murmur moved through the room. Sarah's stomach tightened. This wasn't just another mission. This wasn't about rescuing hostages or saving fellow soldiers. This was about keeping a man alive who had planned death for others. The officer's gaze locked onto her. "Sergeant Martinez, you've been selected." Her throat went dry. "Sir, I'm not a surgeon." "No," he agreed. "But you've shown calm under conditions no one else has. We'll give you accelerated training. Weeks condensed into days. You'll learn what you need to know. The security detail will handle the fighting. Your task is singular: keep the prisoner alive." Sarah's heart raced. The room felt smaller, the weight of the choice pressing in. She thought of her mother's voice, her brother's doubts, the faces of the soldiers who trusted her. And then she thought of the man on the table, the enemy, the architect of bloodshed. Could she save him? More than that, should she? She didn't answer in that moment. She simply nodded. Duty was rarely simple. The following days blurred into exhaustion. She worked beside military surgeons, hands trembling at first, then steadying as muscle memory built. She practiced sutures until her fingers cramped, learned procedures that normally took years to master in hours. Her instructors pushed her past every limit. "You don't have the luxury of failure," one doctor told her. "The patient dies, the mission fails, and the mission cannot fail." When Sarah finally stepped off the helicopter at the ruined hospital where the prisoner lay, she carried more than just medical supplies. She carried the crushing knowledge that success meant saving a life she despised. The hospital was a shell, walls cracked, windows blown out, the stench of smoke and dust clinging to every surface. Echoes of gunfire rolled in the distance. Inside, her patient lay pale and broken, younger than she expected, not much older than. Her breath caught. For a moment, he wasn't an enemy. He was just another man bleeding out. The Delta Force operators formed a tight ring around her, weapons raised. Their presence was a reminder. This wasn't just medicine. This was war in its form. Sarah scrubbed in with trembling hands, the local doctor assisting her speaking only fractured English. The equipment was crude. The light flickered, and still she began. Cut, clamp, suture. Her hands moved with precision born not of experience but of necessity. Hours passed in a haze of blood and sweat. Twice, explosions shook the building, dust raining down as Delta operators returned fire outside. Each time, Sarah refused to stop. Her voice, calm and low, filled the silence, not for the patient who was unconscious but for herself. Steady hands, steady hands. When at last the bleeding slowed, when the torn tissue was stitched, when the weak pulse steadied beneath her fingers, she allowed herself a single breath of relief. The man would live. But survival was only the beginning. In the days that followed, Sarah stayed by his side, monitored his vitals, adjusted IVs, treated infection. Outside, the war raged. Inside, she fought her own battle. Because each time she looked at him, she remembered the briefings, the attacks he had orchestrated, the lives stolen by his plans. Every instinct screamed, let him go, let him fade. And yet when he stirred awake, when his eyes fluttered open and landed on her, she felt something deeper. Not forgiveness, not sympathy, but the reminder of her oath. A medic saves lives, without condition, without judgment. One night the hospital came under heavy assault. Enemy fighters stormed the perimeter, determined to reclaim or silence their leader. Gunfire rattled through the halls, closer, louder. Delta operators shouted orders, their rifles roaring back. Sarah's heart hammered as footsteps thundered nearer. She grabbed her rifle, stood between the bed and the door. The prisoner lay unconscious, helpless, and in that moment Sarah made a choice she never imagined. She would defend him. She shouted in broken Pashto, voice trembling but clear, "Medic here, he is patient, you must not harm." The fighters paused, shocked by the sight. A small American woman, weapon raised, standing guard over their own leader. The chaos pressed against the walls, but Sarah didn't move. Her arms shook, but her voice was steady. "If you want him, you go through me." The firefight tore on. Minutes felt like hours. The operators held the line, and Sarah, switching between rifle and bandages, between soldier and medic, kept her patient alive through it all. When the evacuation finally arrived, she was drenched in sweat, eyes bloodshot, body trembling from 36 hours without rest. Yet she refused to leave until the prisoner was secured on the stretcher, IV steady, vitals monitored. Only then did she collapse, her body giving out as the helicopter lifted. Back in the United States, when medals were pinned to her chest months later, she barely heard the speeches. Applause rang hollow. All she could see were the faces, Davis in the square, the hostages in the compound, the enemy she had saved. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had simply refused to stand still. And she understood now, more than ever, courage wasn't about who you saved. It was about refusing to decide who wasn't worth saving. Why did applause always sound so hollow? The medal pinned to her chest gleamed under the lights, the voices of generals echoing words like heroism and valor. Cameras flashed. Hands clapped. But Sarah stood there feeling strangely absent from it all. Her body in uniform, her soul still in the dust of that ruined hospital. She remembered the smell of antiseptic mixed with smoke, the pulse she fought to keep alive in a man who had never deserved her protection, the moment she stood between him and the barrel of an enemy rifle. They were calling it courage. To her, it felt like something harder to define, duty, or maybe just defiance, the refusal to abandon humanity in a place built to erase it. When the ceremony ended, she tucked the medal away in a drawer she would rarely open again. She wasn't chasing recognition. She never had been. But the world of soldiers had changed around her. Within weeks, requests began pouring in. Navy SEAL teams, Army Rangers, Marine recon units, even Delta Force. Units preparing for high-risk operations wanted her. Word had spread. Martinez never left the wounded. She wasn't the medic who waited until it was safe. She was the one who ran through fire, who improvised smoke from antiseptic bottles, who held the line when everyone else faltered. It was flattering and terrifying, because each request carried the weight of expectation. She wasn't just Sarah anymore. She was the medic who wouldn't quit, and reputations are heavier than gear. Late at night, lying awake in her bunk, she replayed the missions in her head. Davis bleeding out in the square, the hostages gasping in the compound, the prisoner whose life she guarded when the world wanted him dead. Each memory pressed on her chest like a stone. She told herself she was steady, calm, reliable. But inside, she wrestled with questions that had no clear answers. How many lives could she carry before one slipped through her fingers? And when that day came, as it surely would, what would it do to her? The Marines were the first to ask for her by name. Captain, the same man who had once told her she reminded them why they fought, sent word that his unit wouldn't step into the next firestorm without her. When she joined them for briefing, no one questioned her presence. No skeptical glances, no whispered doubts. They handed her the floor. "What's your plan if we take casualties?" asked. Sarah blinked. For the first time, she realized they weren't just including her in tactical planning. They were depending on her foresight. She outlined triage protocols, casualty evacuation routes, contingency plans if extraction failed. The Marines nodded, taking notes. Soldiers who had stared at her with suspicion months ago now treated her as equal, sometimes more than equal. That shift carried a strange ache, because part of her missed the anonymity of being underestimated. It had been simpler to surprise people than to carry their faith. The mission was brutal. A compound stormed at dawn, gunfire tearing through walls, explosions ripping the ground. Sarah was everywhere, her hands covered in blood, her voice commanding calm. She saved 2 Marines under fire, stabilized a local child wounded in the crossfire, and carried an unconscious hostage across the landing zone while rounds kicked dirt at her boots. When the helicopter lifted them out, clasped her shoulder. "We don't go without you again," he said simply. Those words followed her, to the Rangers, to the SEALs, to every unit that asked for her presence. She became a name passed between warriors, a promise of survival in places where survival felt impossible. But each success carved deeper into her. One night after returning from a mission that had pushed her past exhaustion, Sarah sat outside the base, staring at the Afghan sky. The stars were sharp against the darkness, too bright, almost mocking. His voice replayed in her mind from years ago. "You hate loud noises. How are you supposed to go to war?" She whispered into the empty air, "I don't know." Her chest ached, not from fear, from the relentless weight of being needed. Because what none of them saw, what no legend ever included, was the cost. The sleepless nights, the trembling hands she hid until they steadied, the dreams that dragged her back into firefights long after the bullets had stopped. Yet even in the quietest, most broken moments, Sarah couldn't imagine walking away. Not when men like Davis still called her family. Not when Marines trusted her more than their own armor. Not when a 6-year-old back home had drawn her as an angel with wings, thanking her for bringing her father home. The weight was crushing, but it was also what kept her standing. Because every request, every mission, every pair of eyes that turned to her in crisis whispered the same truth. They needed her. And she would not stand still. Why was the air so heavy before the mission even began? Sarah stood in the operations tent, surrounded by Delta Force operators preparing their gear. Their movements were precise, efficient, almost ritualistic. Every snap of a magazine, every check of a radio frequency was muscle memory born from years of war. But the silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. At the center of the table lay the briefing, a prisoner rescue. Not American contractors this time, not soldiers. This was bigger. A high-value target held by insurgents, guarded by layers of defenses in one of the most hostile districts in Afghanistan. Intelligence suggested civilians were also trapped inside, shields, bargaining chips, collateral. Failure was not an option, and yet the margin for success was razor-thin. Captain Hale, Delta's team leader, looked across the table. His eyes found Sarah. "Martinez, you know why you're here. Hostages will be broken, malnourished, wounded. Some may already be close to death. We need them alive, or this mission isn't worth the risk." Her throat tightened. She nodded once, understood. But inside, she felt the familiar twist of fear. Not of dying. She had long since made peace with that. No, what haunted her was the possibility of failing them, of losing one life too many in front of hands that trusted her to save them all. The helicopter blades tore through the night hours later, whipping dust across the landing zone. Sarah crouched low between 2 operators, her medical pack strapped tight, her rifle slung across her chest. She breathed steady, trying to quiet the storm inside her. She wasn't here to be brave. She was here to be steady. The compound loomed like a shadowed beast in the distance, walls jagged, lights faint. As the team approached, the first burst of gunfire shattered the silence. Muzzle flashes erupted from windows. The fight had begun. Sarah dropped behind cover, heart hammering, but she didn't freeze. She never froze anymore. Her hands moved automatically, checking her pack, tightening straps, preparing for what she knew was coming. The breach was loud, violent. Delta operators stormed the entrance with precision, clearing rooms in seconds. Sarah moved with them, close enough to respond, far enough not to hinder. Her boots crunched against shattered glass, her breath loud in her ears. The hostages were found in a basement, 3 of them. Broken, gaunt, terrified. One man couldn't even lift his head. Another clutched his chest in pain. The third wept silently, too weak to speak. Martinez now, Hale barked. She dropped to her knees, the world narrowing to her patience. One man's pulse raced erratically. Arrhythmia. Another was fatting fast, his breathing shallow, ribs broken. The third trembled violently from dehydration and shock. Her hands flew from one to the next. IV lines, fluids, stabilizing breaths, compressing a chest when the heartbeat faltered. "Stay with me," she whispered, voice steady despite the storm inside. "I've got you, you're not done yet." Gunfire rattled the ceiling. Dust rained down. The building shook from controlled detonations as Delta cleared adjacent rooms. She barely noticed. Her world existed in inches, the space between a failing pulse and a heartbeat restored. One hostage seized violently, his body jerking. Sarah held him down with one arm, her other hand threading a line with impossible precision. Electricity from a defibrillator kit cracked through the air. The heartbeat steadied. Another groaned, blood filling his mouth. She tilted his head, cleared his airway, whispered fiercely, "Breathe. That's all you need to do, just breathe." Minutes bled into eternity. And then the voice over the radio, urgent, desperate. "Man down, North Corridor, we need the medic now." Sarah's chest clenched. She looked at the hostages, alive but fragile. She looked at the operators, their eyes sharp, waiting for her decision. If she left, the hostages might deteriorate. If she stayed, a soldier would bleed out without her. Her mind split in two. The medic oath, the duty to her team, the weight of every life balanced on a knife's edge. Her decision came in a heartbeat. She grabbed a ranger standing guard. "You keep this line steady, don't let go. If it fails, he dies." Her voice was sharp, commanding, not a request, an order. Then she sprinted down the corridor. The scene was chaos, an operator sprawled in blood, a gunshot wound tearing through his abdomen. Bullets sparked against the wall as insurgents pressed forward. Sarah dove beside him, hands already working. Gauze, pressure, clamp. Her knees slick with blood. "Stay with me," she shouted over the roar of rifles. "You're not leaving me here." The operator's eyes fluttered, glassy, but his grip found her wrist. He held on, as if her presence alone tethered him to life. She stabilized him enough for extraction. Then she dragged him, alone, muscles screaming, back to the safe zone, refusing to let go. By the time she returned, the hostages were still alive. Shaken, weak, but alive. The ranger had followed her orders to the letter. The team moved fast, loading hostages and the wounded operator onto stretchers, carrying them through gunfire to the landing zone. Sarah's lungs burned, her legs trembled, but she didn't slow. The helicopter blades roared overhead. As they lifted, she knelt over the operator's chest, one hand pressing hard on the wound, the other holding an IV steady. She didn't blink, didn't look away, not even as the night lit up with tracers outside. When the bird finally cleared the combat zone, Captain Hale crouched beside her. His voice was low, but it cut through everything. "You kept all of them alive," he said. "All of them." Sarah shook her head faintly. "Not me, them, they kept fighting." But Hale only looked at her for a long moment, then said words she would carry forever. "You're the kind of soldier people don't write about, but you're the one we all remember." Her body sagged against the bulkhead, exhaustion pulling at her. She closed her eyes, the rotor's thrum filling her ears, the weight of the night pressing heavy. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, she wondered, how many more times could she do this before something inside her finally broke? Why did home feel so far away, even when she finally stood in it? Texas stretched wide before her, flat roads, big skis, the hum of cicadas in the evening air. The diner's neon sign flickered the same way it always had, but to Sarah, everything felt different. The quiet was louder than mortars, the stillness heavier than combat gear. Her mother hugged her tight, whispering prayers of relief. Her father shook her hand, grip firm, eyes moist with pride he didn't say out loud. Cracked a joke about her finally being tougher than him, though his voice wavered. They tried to make her feel like the girl she once was, the daughter, the sister, the waitress who dreamed of becoming a teacher. But that girl no longer existed. At night, Sarah woke in a cold sweat, hearing the echo of gunfire, smelling smoke that wasn't there. She would sit on the edge of her bed, staring into the dark, her hands trembling until she whispered to herself, "Steady hands, steady hands." She told no one, not her family, not her friends. They saw the uniform, the medals, the trident pin still tucked into her pocket, and they believed the story was simple. Hero comes home. But war never leaves simple stories behind. Sarah carried memories like invisible scars. Davis whispering about his wife as blood drained from his body. The Afghan doctor who had walked into fire with nothing but a white cloth and faith. The hostages, fragile pulses under her hands. The enemy prisoner whose life she defended when every instinct told her to step aside. She wondered if anyone back home could ever understand. And yet, part of her knew it didn't matter. Some burdens weren't meant to be spoken. Some truths were too heavy for words. Months passed. She tried to settle into civilian rhythm. Coffee in the mornings, walks down quiet streets, conversations about groceries and weather. But whenever someone thanked her for her service, she felt the same hollowness she had felt under applause. Because how could she explain that service wasn't glory? It was blood under her nails. It was nights of trembling silence. It was standing guard over a man she despised because life, any life, was sacred. One afternoon, Sarah received a letter. It was from Petty Officer Davis's daughter, written in crayon. The same child who had once drawn her with angel wings. This time the picture was different. It showed her standing in front of a man on a stretcher, her arms wide as if shielding him. Above the drawing, the child had scrawled, "My daddy says you protect everyone. That makes you the bravest." Sarah stared at the paper for a long time, her chest tightening, tears slipping down her cheeks. A 6-year-old had captured the truth she could never explain. It wasn't about sides. It wasn't about victories. It was about refusing to let fear decide who deserved to live. The years that followed were quieter. She worked at the VA, tending to soldiers whose scars were visible and invisible. She listened more than she spoke. She taught new medics not just how to treat wounds, but how to carry themselves when the weight of the world pressed down. She never sought recognition. She never retold her missions in detail. But among soldiers, her name remained, passed like a story told in firelight. Martinez, the medic who never stood still. The one who ran into fire. The one who believed that saving a life mattered, no matter whose it was. And when young recruits asked how she found the courage, she only smiled faintly. Because she knew courage wasn't a thing you found. It was a choice you made, over and over again in silence when no one was watching. Years later, standing alone on a quiet hillside, Sarah looked at the horizon and finally allowed herself a breath of peace. She thought of the square in that Afghan village, of Doctor's steady voice, of hand on her shoulder, of Hale's words. "You're the kind of soldier people don't write about, but you're the one we all remember." She closed her eyes and let the silence settle. Because the truth was simple, even if the world didn't always see it. Sometimes courage isn't loud. Sometimes it isn't wrapped in medals or carved into monuments. Sometimes it's just a medic kneeling in the dirt, refusing to move while the world falls apart around her. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.